By July 1789, the United States Constitution had been ratified for approximately 1 year. At this time, there were still many who were firmly against the powers that the Constitution gave the federal government. These forms of controversy inspired John Adams, a Federalist, to share with Roger Sherman, a distinguished member of the Constitutional Convention, his issues with the Constitution. Although Adams firmly believed in a strong central government and a written constitution, he was disturbed by the possibility of an imbalance of power. This attempt at a balance of power framed in the Constitution not only influenced Adams' beliefs in 1789, but his own presidential administration beginning in 1796. Adams was writing to Sherman during the occurring critical period in American history, which would decide how the country's government would be formed. Sherman and Adams were both Federalists in favor of the Constitution and its ratification. This Federalist term would later change in meaning, but in 1789, all in favor of the Constitution were known as Federalists. Although Adams was a Federalist, he was overseas in England during the Constitutional Convention. Consequently, his voice did not influence the Constitution as much as other prominent delegates such as James Madison. Because of this, Adams explains to Sherman the problems he has with the Constitution, problems he was not able to share at the convention. Sherman, as a member of the convention, clearly did not have as much apprehension as Adams, as he and the rest of the delegates eventually reached an agreement in 1787. Overall, by the time Adams was complaining to Sherman, the convention had concluded without Adams's influence present. When Adams wrote to Sherman, he specifically addresses the problems regarding the president's power. For instance, when Adams compares the president's powers to that of any other republic magistrate excluding England, the president has much more authority than any other. Specifically, Adams addresses that the president can appoint ambassadors, raise armies, manage the treasury, and control the internal and external affairs of the nation. When explaining these presidential powers, Adams explains the nervousness by stating, "They must naturally and necessarily excite in the nation all the jealousy, envy, fears, apprehensions, and opposition that are so constantly observed in England against the crown." Due to all these powers, Adams understands why the people are skeptical towards giving the president so much power. After all, United States citizens did not want to be involved in a monarchy so quickly after they fought to break away from one. To be specific, with only 6 years in between the Revolutionary War and the Constitution, United States residents were still wary of their natural rights being in jeopardy. Overall, Adams understands that the citizens have a right to feel threatened by another magistrate controlling their nation. However, Adams does understand how important these laws are. As a Federalist, Adams believes that a government can only function with a strong central government, including a powerful president. Plus, citizens can only be protected if they accept these presidential powers. In this case, Adams promotes Whig ideology by explaining that the citizens must sacrifice some of their rights in order to be guaranteed protection. This defends a constant trend that Adams is inspired by Federalist, or in other words, British, beliefs. In fact, Adams believed that the president would need even more power in order to maintain peace in the United States. By stating, "I think that they ought to have been still greater or much less," Adams reveals that if the president does not have almost unmatched power, then his position is virtually useless and should be given little to no power at all. Specifically, Adams does not favor the idea that the president is limited when declaring war or peace. Additionally, by not giving the president a separate branch, Adams believes that the president's powers are insignificant. This foreshadows decisions Adams made during his administration beginning in 1796. For instance, the Alien and Sedition Act, enacted in 1798 under President Adams, drastically strengthened the power of the central government. Specifically, the Sedition Acts prevented the central government party from being criticized. This made it virtually impossible for anyone to publicly disagree with Adams's ideas. By muzzling the Democratic Republicans, Federalists could do as they pleased. Additionally, the Naturalization and Alien Acts limited French influence in the nation. This helped Federalists, who opposed French beliefs while promoting English ways. Although this decision by Adams could have been passed to prevent the French from undermining the United States during the unofficial quasi-war, Adams may have enacted this to limit French influence and in turn promote British ideals. Moreover, Adams's questionable decisions as president can be traced back to his beliefs shared with Sherman in 1789. Next, in his letter to Sherman, Adams addresses how important a system of checks and balances is. According to Adams, a balance of power is of high importance because, as Adams states, a simple sovereignty in one, a few, or many has no balance, and therefore no laws. A divided sovereignty without a balance, or in other words, where the division is unequal, is always at war, and consequently has no laws. Although many focused on an equal balance of power between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, Adams concentrated on the checks and balances between the legislative branch and the president. Although today the president is in the executive branch, in 1789, Adams believes the legislative branch consisted of the House, the Senate, and the president. Adams believes that the President is significantly weaker than both the House and Senate. To be specific, although the President can make any decisions, his judgment can often be overruled. As a result, Adams believes the President will not be able to defend himself or the Constitution. This foreshadows how he strengthens the presidential position during his term through the Sedition Acts of 1798. Adams surely enabled the President to defend himself by limiting the opposition from making any accusatory comments. Ultimately, Adams shows the relation between this letter and his administration by strengthening his presidential powers in 1796. Lastly, Adams mentions that human powers are insatiable. This is slightly ironic, as during his administration, many U.S. citizens believe that Adams took advantage of his power. Mainly, citizens favoring the French despise Adams because of the Naturalization Act and Alien Act, which limited nearly all French influence in the United States. Many Americans were skeptical of Adams's rule because Adams favored English ideals. Despite Adams having effective ideas, his Alien and Sedition Acts were unfortunately how he was remembered during his single term. For instance, Adams understood the importance of a system of checks and balances. This system, which promoted the dispersion of power mentioned in Whig ideology, further shows how Adams's use of English ideals were not as monarchic as many citizens believed. However, Adams was criticized for having different ideas as to what an equal balance of power looked like. Plus, since his term lasted in between the Revolutionary War and War of 1812, it was difficult for Adams to present English lifestyle to the apprehensive American citizens. Ultimately, Adams's letter to Sherman hinted at how Adams would try to shape the young nation in 1796.